Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 11 Part 2. In this part of the build log, I'm going to bring the system close to completion. I'm going to work on the custom wiring, and I'm also going to work on the mods. I've decided to make some changes to the mods, and I'm going to be doing a bit more than I originally expected. But I'm going to start with what I've been working on since the last part of the build log. So I've started work on the side panel window mods, and so far I've cut them out, drilled the mounting holes and repainted the panels. So now I just need to cut out some acrylic and fit it into position. You can see the shape of window that I've gone for here, and I've done this previously with the Bitfinex Prodigy, and this is really the biggest window you can go for unless you're going to use thinner than 3mm acrylic for the window, because if you install a full side panel window, for example, the acrylic is not going to properly fit between the side panel and the motherboard tray. And I think you can see what I mean. There's only a small gap there. Sometimes you can get it to, just squeeze into position if you're using 3mm acrylic, but it's a very, very tight fit. And I'd prefer not to be able to see the side of the motherboard tray and power supply anyway. It is a good place to hide cables there. So obviously I've removed all of the front panel connectivity, which was in the rear side panel, as well as the power and reset button, and also the two extra 2.5-inch hard drive bays. So something else that's been done since the last part of the build log is the beginnings of the custom wiring. I have here a 24-pin, 2 6-pin PCIe and an 8-pin EPS cable, and they've been sleeved in MDPC black heat shrinkless sleeving, and they've been made from scratch with 16 gauge wire and all new components. I mentioned in the last part of the build log that I was thinking about changing the radiator configuration, but I've had a look and realized that the radiator configuration I had is probably the best one with these particular radiators for this build. But what I'm considering now is something I've been looking at since the beginning of this build. Now, initially, due to the budget for this build, I was only supposed to be installing a single 240mm radiator, which was going to cool both the CPU and graphics card. And that may not sound like enough, but if you use something like a Black Ice GTX radiator, which mainly due to its fin array is an extremely high performance radiator, and then also some high performance fans, you can make up for the loss of radiator capacity, and you can get away with having a lot less radiator capacity if you really optimize the radiators and fans that you use and sacrifice a bit of silence. I decided not to go ahead with this mainly because of the thickness of the radiator. It would have come down too close to the motherboard, very close to the top of the graphics card, and really cramped the look of the build and the tubing routing. So I decided to go for this 240mm and 180mm radiator. But now I run into another problem. The ventilation through the front panel is not really good enough for this fan and radiator configuration. It probably would be enough considering that this is an extremely low RPM quiet fan. But I'd like to do something more. So I'm actually going to modify the front panel. And what I'm going to do is something similar to what I did for Client Build 9. I'll put a link on the screen to the Client Build 9 build log. I'm actually going to do the 180mm radiator version of what I did in Client Build 9, and I'm going to do it in white. So I now need to remove all of the hardware from the case that I've installed so far and start cutting up the case. So I'm now cutting out a piece of 10mm white acrylic with a jigsaw. And I actually have a bandsaw on the way, so that's what I'll be using for this kind of thing from now on. And I'm sanding the edges with a mouse sander. This can easily be done also by hand, but whatever you use to cut the acrylic to some extent is going to leave fairly rough edges. And considering I'll need to polish this acrylic, there is a fair bit of work to do to smooth off the edges. And I've now filed the corners because they need to be the same shape as the case. They need to be curved. That can also be done with even a rasp or just rough sandpaper. And I'm just doing a quick test fit to make sure that this panel is the same shape as the front panel of the case. And it's a perfect fit, so the next thing I'm going to move on to is the mounting holes. And the mounting holes with something like this, the positioning of them is very critical. Even if you're out 0.5 millimeter with a couple of the holes, it's often too much. And mainly for the fan and radiator, there is very little leeway, and you can also see when the holes are not positioned correctly. One way of giving yourself a little bit more leeway and getting around this problem to some extent is drilling out the holes a little bit bigger than they need to be, but you can't take this too far, obviously. Maybe go one size bigger than they need to be. And that just gives you a little bit more leeway, but getting the holes in the correct positions to begin with is what you really need to do. So take a lot of time and care to perfectly position those holes. When you're marking them out, that's the main thing. If you mark them out correctly, then obviously drilling them in the correct position is not going to be a problem. So I've now cut out the circle for the ventilation for the 180 millimeter fan. The diameter of this circle is actually 170 millimeters, which is the exact diameter of the fan blades of the fan that I'm using. And I usually do that. I make the hole the same size as the fan blades because it just looks a whole lot better when the fan blades fit in there perfectly. Now this is the cover panel. This is going to sit over the top of the fan, as I've mentioned, similar to what I did in Client Build 9. So I've cut out the cover panel and I'm now drilling the mounting holes. And I now need to do a full test fit of the front panel mods. You can see that I've cut out the front panel of the BitPhoenix Prodigy. So there's really not much left of the original front panel. And I've also drilled the mounting holes in the 4 corners. And I've now installed the new front panel. I've also installed the fan and radiator onto the new front panel. You can see that there's still some mounting holes left, and this is for the cover panel. Now at this point I've beveled the outside edge of the new front panel, but I haven't yet smoothed off and beveled the edge around the fan. You need to be extremely careful when beveling, obviously, particularly when beveling by hand. If you don't maintain the same angle and depth, it is very, very easy to see. So what I do is usually use a coarse grit sandpaper or a file, and you need to maintain more of a movement along the side of the panel instead of a movement across the side of the panel. And that way you can get an even bevel. So I'm now test fitting the cover panel, and at this point I'm using nuts as spacers, but I will make up some kind of a custom spacer for that. You can see that I've also beveled and rounded off the edges of the cover panel, but I still need to polish all of the edges. I'm now coming up with a different mounting system for the pump and roast config. Initially I was going to mount it to the back of the radiator. As I mentioned, to do this I would need to come up with some kind of a custom mounting system, because usually I use UN mounts for this kind of thing, but there's no UN mount for a 180 millimeter radiator. It would be very difficult to make up something similar to a UN mount by hand. I'd end up blocking too much airflow from the radiator. So I've decided to mount the pump and res config to the bottom panel of the case, and to do this I'm going to use an EK mounting system, which is really specifically designed for this config. So you'll see this mounting system coming up in the build log. So coming back to the front panel mods, I'm now polishing the edges of all of the acrylic that I've cut. And what I've done, I've sanded it back to 2000 grit. And when you're sanding, you need to be very careful to sand properly, cover the entire surface area, because if there's scratches left, you won't see them until later, probably not until you're polishing with the Dremel. And then you need to go right back to the sandpaper grit that you didn't sand enough with to sand out the scratches, and then go right through all of the sandpaper grits again and then polish again. So it's really a lot of work. So make sure you sand thoroughly. And make sure there's fairly small gaps between your sandpaper grits, maybe 200 to 300 to start off with, and then larger gaps towards the end. And you need to take it back to at least 2000 grit before you start polishing. And I recommend using wet and dry sandpaper, and definitely use water with it. It makes it a lot quicker and easier. And what I'm using here now is a Dremel with a cloth polishing attachment. There's a lot of different power tools with a lot of different polishing attachments that you could use to do this, but make sure that you turn down the RPM very low. I've got the RPM down as low as it goes with the Dremel, because otherwise you can burn and damage the surface of the acrylic. It is fairly sensitive like that. And what I'm using here is a plastic polish from Novus. I've mentioned this product a number of times previously in my videos, and I use this product all the time for, you know, all different plastics. The best thing it's for is when you accidentally damage a side panel window or some other acrylic or plastic in a build, and you can make it look like new again. So I obviously start with the heavy scratch remover with the Dremel, then the fine scratch remover with the Dremel, and then I use the fine scratch remover again by hand, and then the clean and shine just to clean up the surface. I've completed the polishing, so the front panel mods are finished and ready to be assembled. You can see that I've also drilled a hole in the front panel for a ModSmart 22mm red ring vandal switch. This is going to be for the power button, and this is in the middle at the top of the front panel. Now you might notice there's some flat spots around the fan. It's very difficult to get a circle like this freehand. Basically, the bigger the circle, the more difficult it is to get the correct shape. It's easy to get small flat spots, and that's what I have here, so I'll need to go back and repair this. You can see that I've also finished the cover panel, but I still need to make the spaces that are going to go between the cover panel and the front panel. I've now completely disassembled the case. Now I much prefer to disassemble the case before painting it. You know, I can still paint a case that is fully assembled, but you're going to get a far better finish, you know, on the inside of the case. Also, there's parts of the case that don't even get covered if you leave it fully assembled. So I prefer to fully disassemble the case to get an even high quality finish, and also full cover across all of the panels. It's very easy to disassemble a case like this. All you need to do is drill out the rivets, you know, undo some bolts, screws. Most of the time, even with the largest cases, it takes no more than 20 minutes to completely strip a case down. And then assembling it again afterwards takes about the same amount of time. So I've completed the painting, and you can see the holes that I've drilled here in the bottom panel. This is going to be to mount the pump and res config. I'm really happy with the finish I've managed to get. It's a semi-gloss finish. It's going to be very durable. So all I need to do now is reassemble the case, rivet the panels back together. All of the mods are complete and just need to be assembled. And to reassemble a case like this literally takes less than 5 minutes. It's very quick and easy. So I've assembled the case with the new mods. I just need to install the cover panel on the front, as you can see. And I've also now installed most of the components. I've installed all of the fans and radiators, motherboard, everything on the motherboard, the graphics card, the hard drive, and the SSD. So really the build is back up to the point it was at before I went ahead with the front panel mods. I've now also completed the side panel mods, so all of the mods for this build are now complete. Now just briefly, I'm going to go through all of the materials I've used for the mods. For the side panel windows, I've used 3mm clear acrylic. For the front panel, I used 10mm white acrylic, and for the cover panel, 3mm white acrylic. The bolts I've used are all M4 button head Allen key bolts, except for the 55mm M4 socket head Allen key bolts I used to mount the front fan and radiator. On the side panels, I've used 6mm bolts. To mount the front panel to the case, I used 12mm bolts. To mount the cover panel, I've had to cut down some 30mm bolts to length. You'll notice on the front panel I've used M4 white nylon washers, whereas on the side panels I've used black washers, and I'm going to swap the black washers to the white nylon washers to match. I've also used M4 nuts on the side panels. The paint I've used is an acrylic lacquer and it's a standard white. I've completed the assembly of the front panel mods. I've now installed the cover panel, and the spacers I've used are 10mm steel spacers painted black, and I actually managed to fit M4 nuts inside of the spacers. So there's 3 M4 nuts inside each one to help to center the spacers and to lock the entire config together. Now, looking at the front panel mods, the cover panel looks very big. It is a lot of blank space, but that's not unusual to see on a front panel. But still, I think it could do with something to increase the detail. You do need to consider that part of the design of these front panel mods is the lighting. I was actually hoping that the transparency of the cover panel and the brightness of the LEDs from the red LED fan was going to be enough for there to be a red glow through the cover panel. But it turns out the LEDs aren't bright enough, the cover panel is not transparent enough, so there is no red glow through that panel at all, but there is a slight glow around the outside. I'm thinking about increasing this glow by installing more lighting around the inside of the cover panel to help to increase the detail on the front panel. The next thing I need to move on to now is the tubing, but before I can start the tubing, there's a few things that need to be done. First of all, I need to swap the stock single opening top on the reservoir to the triple opening top, and I also need to install an aqua pipe. The reason for this is, if you take a look at this config, as I've mentioned, there's only a single outlet on the pump top, so there's no inlets, which means you need to run the loop back to the top of the res. And if you're going to do that, you need to install an aqua pipe or similar component to bring the coolant coming into the res below the level of the coolant in the res to stop air from going into the loop and to stop noise. The other thing I'm going to do is install the EKFC bridge single instead of the stock EKFC link, and it's just going to give me more inlet and outlet options. So you can see the difference between the two here. This is the stock EKFC link, which has the single inlet and outlet at the top, and this is the EKFC bridge single, which has an inlet and outlet on both sides. So I've installed the triple opening top and aqua pipe onto the pump and res config, and I'm actually still waiting on the EK mounting system that I'm going to use to mount the pump and res config into the case. So I'll need that also before I can start the tubing. You can see the inlet and outlet configuration that I'm going for here with the EKFC bridge single. And basically all this has achieved is a shorter tubing routing, because from the graphics card I'm going to drop straight down to the 180mm radiator. So it's now time for me to start the tubing, and the tubing that I'm going to use in this build is 10mm ID, 12mm OD, and I'm actually going to use EK tubing, but I could also use E22 tube or Bits Power Crystal Link. The problem with Bits Power Crystal Link is the length limit, but I've noticed that Bits Power is now releasing longer sections of tube. But it's really all the same tube. It's, clear acrylic tube with a 1mm wall thickness. The fittings I'm going to use in this build is Bits Power Multi-Link. I'm going to use a combination of the dual O-ring and single O-ring fittings. And I'm also going to bend the acrylic tube. So what I have here is a 10mm diameter silicon cord from EK. But that's it for this part of the build log. I'll start the tubing at the beginning of the next video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.